Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us.
This time we're going to be talking about something pretty relevant, even though it's rooted in history. We're diving into free speech in America.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, we've got legal cases, stories about some pretty major figures, and even some philosophical arguments to kind of pick apart. Yeah, and what's really fascinating to me is how America seems to have this constant, internal struggle with actually upholding it.
It is quite a paradox, isn't it? You would think that a nation that really fought a revolution over free speech
Welcome
would
back,
have
everyone,
like a
to
perfect
Rambling Dan
record,
Rose
but
Deep Dive Book Reviews.
the
We're
truth
glad
is
to
that
have
there's
you
this
with us.
pattern, I think, of celebrating free speech, as an ideal,
Right.
while simultaneously trying to limit it in practice.
Yeah.
And that's been going on for centuries in America.
Yeah, so, okay, let's unpack this a little bit. We got to start, I think, with early America. We're fresh off breaking away from British rule. They were pretty fed up with censorship back then, right?
Absolutely. I think the whole American approach to free speech was really a direct reaction to what they had just lived through under the British Crown.
Right.
So, criticizing the monarchy could land you in some pretty hot water.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of enshrining free speech as a fundamental right, that was pretty revolutionary.
So where did that come from? Where did this whole concept of free speech being like a basic human right?
Well, John Locke had a huge influence on the Founding Fathers. His whole concept of inalienable rights, that is, rights that the government can't take away, included freedom of thought. And so...
So those basic rights, the ones that no government can infringe upon, like life, liberty, and property.
Exactly. And figures like James Madison, who was so important in writing the Constitution, saw free speech as one of those, one of those core inalienable rights, I think. He really believed that, open debate and the free flow of ideas were absolutely crucial to a healthy democracy.
So you have America, right? Founded on this radical idea of free speech as as a fundamental right, Everyone's fired up about this new freedom, and then what happens? Does everyone just live happily ever after in this land of free speech?
I wish. Sadly, no.
Yeah.
Almost immediately we start to see cracks in the facade. Some of the very figures who led the charge for revolution, people like John Adams,
Oh, wow.
they ended up using tactics like the Sedition Act to silence their opponents.
John Adams. Wait a minute. He's the guy on the $2 bill?
That's him.
He was trying to limit free speech?
He was. Adams and his Federalist allies, they were worried about instability, especially in the newly formed nation. They thought that allowing people to criticize the government openly, would undermine its authority,
Okay.
maybe even lead to chaos.
Interesting.
And, it was a pretty fragile time. And they saw maintaining order, I think, as being paramount.
So basically it's like free speech for all as long as you agree with us, right?
Sadly, I think that kind of double standard, you see it time and time again throughout American history. Take Samuel Adams, for example, a real key figure in the Sons of Liberty. He actually ended up labeling dissenters as seditionists for protests that were very similar in nature to the Boston Tea Party.
Whoa. Samuel Adams, Mr. Revolution himself, turning against protests? That's wild.
It really makes you think about how complex these founding fathers were, doesn't it?
It does.
Their views on free speech were often shaped by the politics of their time.
Right.
Their desire to protect their own interests, and really we can't forget about Thomas Jefferson, who's another figure with a kind of complicated history when it comes to free speech.
Okay.
He started as a very staunch advocate, but then later as president took actions that kind of contradicted his initial stance.
Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the guy who championed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, had issues with free speech. What happened there?
Well, just like Adams, Jefferson faced criticism and challenges during his presidency.
Right.
And there were instances where he too resorted to measures that kind of clash with his earlier beliefs about free speech.
Yeah.
It highlights that tension between protecting free speech on the one hand and maintaining order on the other.
Right.
A tension that really continues to this day.
So right from the get-go, America has this back and forth, right? Free speech, this lofty ideal, but it's always kind of butting up against this reality of, political maneuvering.
Right.
And attempts to control what people can say. And that's where this concept of bad tendency comes in.
Exactly. For centuries, legal thinking about free speech was very much influenced by Blackstone's bad tendency rationale.
Uh,
And this idea it allowed the government to restrict speech based on its potential to cause harm or unrest, even if no actual harm had even occurred.
so this bad tendency thing, that's pretty ominous. Can you explain how that worked in practice? Like, what did that mean for people who were speaking out?
Well, Blackstone, he argued that it was the government's duty to kind of prevent harm before it even happened.
Okay.
And that included suppressing speech that might lead to some kind of negative consequence, even if it hadn't yet.
I see.
And this rationale was used to justify all sorts of restrictions on free speech, particularly when it came to political dissent and criticism of those in power.
So the government could essentially silence you if they thought your words might cause trouble down the line, even if you weren't actually, calling for anything illegal.
That's right. And a perfect example of this is the case of Henry Redhead York.
Redhead York. That sounds like a pirate more than a free speech martyr. Honestly, who was he?
Yeah. York he was a fascinating guy. Born in Barbuda, he became very involved in radical politics, both in England and France. Around the time of the American Revolution. And he was a really talented writer, known for his sharp prose and really insightful commentary.
So what got him in trouble with the authorities?
His writing.
Yeah.
York was a big advocate for reform, and he frequently criticized the British government,
Okay.
supported the American Revolution, and was openly critical of the Crown's policies. So naturally, this didn't sit well with those in power.
And that landed him with the sedition charge.
Exactly. York's case is a perfect illustration, I think, of how this bad tendency rationale was used to shut down dissenting voices.
Right.
The government didn't actually have to prove that his writing actually caused any harm, only that it had the potential to.
So this wasn't just some abstract legal theory.
Right.
Bad tendency had real consequences for those who dared to, challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And as we move into the 20th century, we'll see how this concept continues to influence legal thinking about free speech and ultimately leads to some landmark trials that really reshaped how America grapples with this fundamental right.
All right, so we were just talking about how this bad tendency idea really casts a long shadow over free speech in America, and as we kind of move into the 20th century, things start to get really interesting. We've got like some major legal battles that really change the landscape of free speech.
That's right. The 20th century really did bring about some pretty significant shifts in how the courts viewed free speech, and there's some really pivotal cases that helped redefine its boundaries in America.
Yeah, one that comes to mind, I think, for a lot of people is Schenck v. United States.
Right.
It's the one with that famous shouting fire in a crowded theater analogy, right? Yeah. That one always stuck with me.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
Schenck v. United States, decided in 1919. It really is a landmark case.
Mm-hmm.
This is where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. first introduced the clear and present danger test,
Yeah.
which attempted to strike a balance between protecting free speech and addressing concerns about national security.
So Holmes is the one who came up with that analogy. It's interesting, though, because that analogy is often used to justify limiting speech,
Right.
which seems kind of, I don't know, at odds with the idea of protecting free speech,
Yeah, it's true. The analogy, while memorable, it is often misinterpreted.
Right.
Taken out of context, I think. The Schenck case itself involved a socialist named Charles Schenck who distributed leaflets urging young men to resist the draft during World War I, and he was convicted under the Espionage Act, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court.
And that's where Holmes's clear and present danger test comes in.
Yeah. Holmes, he argued that the First Amendment's protection of free speech isn't absolute.
Right.
And he used the analogy of, someone shouting fire in a crowded theater to illustrate his point.
Right.
Arguing that that such speech, creates a clear and present danger that the government has a right to prevent.
Yeah, in that situation, it makes sense, right? Like your words could cause immediate panic,
Yeah.
Harm, and the government, they might have to step in.
Exactly. However, Despite its, I think, good intentions, the clear and present danger test ended up being used to restrict a lot of speech that arguably didn't pose a real and immediate threat.
So even a test that's meant to safeguard free speech can be open to interpretation and potentially lead to abuses.
Right.
Is that what happened with Schenck? Was his speech really that dangerous?
Well, I think that's debatable. What's important is that Schenck really opened the door for the courts to consider context when
Right.
evaluating speech. So it wasn't just about the words themselves,
Right.
but also about the potential consequences of those words
Yeah.
in a specific situation.
That makes sense, but it also seems like, a bit of a slippery slope. Where do you draw the line? Another case you mentioned was Whitney v. California,
Right.
decided in 1927.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Yeah, Whitney v. California. It's a really fascinating case, and it further exposed the limitations of the clear and present danger test. This case involved Charlotte Anita Whitney,
Okay.
a really remarkable woman who came from a very wealthy background, but dedicated her life to social justice. Involved in the suffrage movement, labor activism, and she was even a member of the Communist Labor Party.
Sounds like she was a real force to be reckoned with.
She was.
What was it about her case that challenged the clear and present danger test?
Well, Whitney was convicted under California's Criminal Syndicalism Act for her affiliation with the Communist Labor Party, even though there wasn't any evidence that she personally advocated for violence or anything like that.
So she was basically found guilty by association. That seems pretty unfair.
It was a controversial decision, but what's particularly interesting about this case is Justice Louis Brandeis's concurring opinion. So while he agreed with the majority's decision, he wrote separately to argue that free speech is absolutely essential for individual autonomy
Okay.
and should only be restricted in the most extreme circumstances.
So Brandeis had a different view of free speech than Holmes.
Yes, Brandeis believed that even speech that's considered offensive or unpopular deserves protection because it allows individuals to develop their own thoughts and beliefs. He saw free speech as a foundational element of individual liberty, not just a component of a functioning democracy.
So you have these two, prominent Supreme Court justices, both dealing with the same issue, but they're coming at it from very different angles. That must have made for some pretty interesting debates within the court.
It did, and I think those differing viewpoints help us to understand the complexities of free speech and how the law can be interpreted in various ways.
Right.
These cases, along with others, help shift legal thinking about free speech, moving toward what's known as the functionalist approach.
Functionalist approach. Okay. Break that down for me. What does that mean in the context of free speech?
Essentially, functionalism argues that the value of free speech lies in its ability to facilitate democratic processes
Okay.
and inform decision-making. So the focus kind of shifts from the individual's right to express themselves to the role that free speech plays in society as a whole.
So it's less about you being able to just speak your mind and more about ensuring a system where ideas can be openly debated for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's about seeing free speech as a tool for achieving a well-functioning democracy. Like a marketplace of ideas where the best ones will rise to the top. But while this perspective has its merits, it also has some limitations.
What kind of limitations does prioritizing like a functional democracy mean that some types of speech are like less protected than others?
That's one of the potential downsides. Yeah, functionalism can lead to a kind of hierarchy of speech,
Okay.
where political speech is placed at the top and other forms of expression are deemed less important or less worthy of protection. And this can create a situation where certain types of speech, like artistic expression or even personal opinions, are more easily restricted or censored.
So if you're talking about politics, you're more likely to be protected than if you're sharing your art or your personal beliefs.
In a way, yes. And this is where we start to see the the functionalist approach being used to kind of justify censorship and the suppression of dissenting voices, especially in our modern era.
Hold that thought. We're almost out of time for this part, but this is where things get really relevant to what's happening today, right?
Yeah.
This tension between individual expression and what's deemed, good for society. It's playing out in all sorts of ways.
Absolutely. And in part three, we'll delve into the modern challenges to free speech, which are perhaps even more complex and widespread than ever before. Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you.
Okay, so we're back, and things are getting a bit more complicated now. We've gone from those early, revolutionary ideals about free speech to bad tendency crackdowns, and now this functionalist approach. And it feels like we're in this murky territory where everyone's battling over what's considered acceptable speech these days.
Yeah, you really hit on a key point there. The modern era brings a whole new set of challenges to free speech, and many of which stem from that functionalist approach that we were just discussing.
But how does functionalism, the idea that free speech is good for democracy, how does that actually end up limiting free speech? It seems kind of contradictory.
It does seem counterintuitive, but it is happening. Take social media, for instance. These platforms have essentially become like the modern public square, where people go to exchange ideas or debate issues. But we're seeing a growing trend, I think, of social media companies censoring content that they deem, harmful or misleading.
Right. It's like those fact check labels and content warnings. They're everywhere. And sometimes entire accounts get suspended or even banned. It's a little, I don't know, it can feel like Big Brother is scrutinizing every post.
And that's what's so concerning about it. I mean, these companies, they hold a tremendous amount of power, and there's very little transparency or accountability in how they make these decisions. Who gets to decide what's harmful or misleading? It's a very slippery slope.
Yeah, it does feel like a lot of power is concentrated in the hands of a few tech giants. And it's not just social media. We've also got this cancel culture phenomenon, which also seems to be chilling free speech in other areas of society.
Cancel culture, yeah, that's a prime example, I think, of how functionalist arguments can be used to silence dissenting voices.
Okay.
The idea is that certain viewpoints are so offensive or so harmful that they should be completely shut down.
Yeah.
And anyone who dares to express them should be ostracized or, quote unquote, canceled.
Right. It's like being digitally banished from the public square. And it seems to be happening, everywhere, in the media, in politics, even in academia.
Universities are supposed to be these bastions of open inquiry and debate.
Right.
But they're becoming some of the most restrictive environments when it comes to certain ideas. I mean, we're seeing a rise in ideological conformity on college campuses.
Mm-hmm.
Professors are facing consequences for challenging the prevailing orthodoxy.
It's like the very institutions that should be encouraging, the free exchange of ideas are now some of the most afraid of certain viewpoints being expressed.
It's a disturbing trend.
It is.
And it all circles back to this fundamental question, who gets to decide what's acceptable speech?
Right.
When we start silencing certain viewpoints, even those that we find disagreeable or offensive, we chip away at the very foundation of a free society.
So where do we go from here? How do we kind of navigate this increasingly complex landscape and revitalize like a healthy respect for free speech principles?
Yeah, there's no easy answer. However, I think a crucial starting point is to return to the concept of free speech as a natural right. Something inherent to our humanity, regardless of the popularity or the content of what we express.
Right. So it's about going back to basics, recognizing that the freedom to express ourselves is fundamental to who we are.
Exactly. John Stuart Mill, a prominent philosopher, he captured this idea really beautifully with his harm principle. He argued that speech should only be restricted if it directly results in harm to others.
So unless your words are actually going to hurt someone, you should be free to express yourself. It sounds simple, but I imagine it's much more nuanced than that in practice.
But Mill understood that even speech that's offensive or unpopular can hold value. It allows us to challenge assumptions, to test our beliefs, and to gain a more complete understanding of the world.
Yeah, it reminds me of that quote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." It's about acknowledging that a truly free society is one where even the most challenging or controversial ideas can be expressed without fear.
That's the essence of it. A strong and expansive understanding of free speech is essential for a healthy and vibrant society. It allows us to have those difficult conversations, to engage with diverse perspectives, and ultimately to make more informed decisions, both individually and collectively.
Well, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this complex issue. What are some key takeaways for our listeners? What can we do in our daily lives to ensure that free speech kind of thrives in this age of,
Hmm.
outrage and division?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's no simple answer. But I think it starts uh, you know with engaging in this very conversation,
Right.
both individually and as a society. Right.
Yeah.
We need to be mindful of the language we use,
Hmm.
be more tolerant of differing viewpoints, and more willing to engage in civil discourse, even when it's uncomfortable.
Right. It's about finding that delicate balance, right?
Yeah.
Protecting free speech while also addressing, genuine harms like hate speech or incitement to violence. It's a tightrope walk for
Yeah.
sure, but one we can't afford to ignore.
I agree, and perhaps it's time to re-examine some of our existing approaches. Could something like the fairness doctrine, which was designed to ensure balanced viewpoints on broadcast media, could that be applied to the internet?
Mm.
Or should we, reconsider laws like sedition, which have a history of being used to stifle dissent?
Yeah.
These are just some of the questions I think that we need to grapple with as we navigate this ever-changing landscape of free speech in the digital age.
Yeah, food for thought indeed. This deep dive has been enlightening, but it's also a bit overwhelming. There's so much to consider, so many perspectives to try to understand.
And that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
Free speech it's not about having all the answers. It's about that ongoing process of questioning, debating, and engaging in this crucial conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's deep dive. We hope you'll join us again soon. Until then, stay curious and keep reading.